She hadn't met a guy who would flirt with her like this, at least. This seemed like a challenge, like who would crack the other first, and Sophie knew that she could win. She was hot, and she knew it. "Okay, for spoons, right?" she asked sweetly. "Yeah," Billy answered. "That's a lot of coffee, won't that keep you up all night?" Sophie asked, with a playful smile. "Maybe, but I'll find a way to use all that energy. I know a lot of different exercises, and it helps keep me with the high stamina and staying power I've got," Billy replied, smiling a satisfied smile. She tried hard not to moan in lust. This flirting was turning her on more and more, and she needed release now. "I'll go and make you a cup." Then, she said with a smile, and was about to stand up when Josh spoke. "No, you're all right, babe, I'll go and make this one, you stay here and talk to Billy," Josh said happily, and bent down to kiss her lightly on her head. "Bill, tell Soph about your high school days," Josh continued to Billy. Billy always used to beat everybody at races and gymnastics and stuff, because he had the stamina to just keep on going. Sophie smiled up at Josh. "Really?" "Yeah, once he ran a race with other schools' best racers, and while all of them were panting at the end of it, Billy here hadn't even broken a sweat," Josh said, and Sophie turned to look at Billy. "They used to call him, the Bull. You know." "The Bull," Sophie repeated, as she looked lustfully at Josh's brother, who just smiled playfully back at her. "I'd love to hear about it," she said to Billy, "and maybe you can show me later, by racing Josh." Billy just smiled at her, as she fought inside to control herself. She would remain faithful to Josh. "No, I've never been a racer," Josh replied, as he moved past Sophie towards the glass doors of the kitchen. "Yeah, he's never been able to keep up with my pace," Billy said to Sophie, his eyes holding the real meaning of those words. Now that I'd have to see to believe," Sophie replied, reminding herself that all she was doing was flirting. Billy just continued to smile his charming smile at both her and Josh. "Don't forget, no sugar," he called, as Josh walked into the kitchen. "Yeah, I know, bro," Josh called back over his shoulder. Sophie took a larger sip of wine this time, trying to settle the within her as it flowed like a drug through her body. She told herself again that she was only flirting, and flirting was fine, that she would just let all of her out on Josh later. Slowly, she once again calmed herself, knowing she would be completely faithful, and that flirting was only going to make it better with her and Josh later, so with yet another sip of wine she smiled at Billy playfully. Billy watched as his older brother walked through the glass doors into the kitchen, before his eyes went straight back to staring at the luscious blonde sitting opposite him. Sitting looking at the glinting light in Sophie's big, blue eyes, Billy smiled. "So, Billy, tell me why they called you, the Bull, then?" Sophie said after Josh had walked out of the room, a playful smile on her face that made Billy's rage even harder. "It'd be much easier just to show you," he replied, as he leaned back and smiled. Calm and cool, that would drive her crazy. I bet it would," the 22-year-old replied playfully, as she took another sip of wine. "See something you like, or are you just lost in thought?" Sophie said suddenly, and Billy realized that he had been ogling her for a while without even speaking. He had to remain in control if this was going to work. "I don't know, maybe a closer look would help me decide," he said coolly. Sophie smiled satisfyingly back at him, and gently placed her wineglass on the table before slowly standing up and walking around to stand in front of the other sofa on Billy's left. "Close enough?" she asked playfully, still smiling. "No, maybe a little closer," Billy replied, as he stood up and moved closer to the blonde fiancée. "I thought you pilots had to have good eyesight?" Sophie asked quietly, as she looked up at his face, as they stood only 2 feet apart. "Yeah, but I've always liked to give a very thorough inspection," he replied. But he managed, somehow, not to give in. "Not yet," cool and calm, he thought. "Well, take a look," Sophie said, with another teasing smile. "Hey," Sophie said in mock annoyance, "you shouldn't do that," she finished playfully, as she reached her hands around to take a hold of his. "Shouldn't I?" Billy said, "No, you shouldn't, you naughty boy," Sophie replied playfully, smiling sweetly up at him. Sophie said, "So did I pass your inspection?" Billy returned the blonde girl's smile, and almost laughed to himself. This girl was good. She was the best tease he had ever met, and she knew just how to drive him wild. "Easily," he said, as he looked down into those pretty blue eyes, which were now filled with a teasing light, but that was only the general checking inspection. "See, we usually have to have a feel around too, and then take a test drive, before we can say the inspection was passed." He could have laughed out loud as Sophie's eyes shone. Billy had now regained his composure. "Well, Josh tells me that I'm perfectly fine in the inspection," Sophie said, still smiling playfully up at him. "Yeah, well, the only problem with that is Josh doesn't have the skills I do, he can only test you for so long. Whereas me, I like to make sure, so I like to test all night," he said. Sophie just smiled at him. Billy slowly sat down just before Josh walked through from the kitchen. Josh stood in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil and spooning into Billy's cup another 4 spoons of coffee. How his brother could drink the stuff like tar, he'd never know. Thoughts came and went in his mind, thoughts about him and Sophie, about their wedding, about who he could invite, and what he'd be able to get to wear at such short notice, and where they would get married, to how his family would react when they saw Billy tomorrow. Smiling to himself as he stirred the coffee cup, Josh thought about how happy he was to have 2 people who he loved loads in the same house. Completely unaware of what was happening, Josh walked back through the glass doors and into the lounge. The night continued to pass on much the same, with both Sophie and Billy flirting with words and comments or looks given over glasses and mugs. Playful and teasing smiles abounded, although all of them hidden from Josh, some better than others, and some almost barely hidden at all. As the flirting continued, both Billy and Sophie, Billy planned harder, and Sophie continued to struggle within herself to stay faithful to her new fiancé. Coffee was made for Billy while Sophie and Josh drank more wine, and although the second bottle had been half drunk a few hours after the inspection, neither one of them was more than a little tipsy. Sophie sat smiling once again over the brim of her glass as she sat close to Josh, his arm around her shoulders, and watched as Billy set the mug he had been holding empty for the last 15 minutes down on the coffee table. She felt like electricity was shooting through her. She needed to breathe a little. "Do you want another one?" she asked, as she placed her wineglass on the coffee table, and looked at Josh's brother. "Yeah, sure, as I said before, I love coffee," Billy answered, seeming to be more hyper now due to the amount of coffee he had drunk. "You're crazy drinking that much coffee, Bill, you're going to be up all night," Josh laughed, as he finished the wine in his glass, and reached to top up his and Sophie's. "That's what I'm planning on," Billy laughed lightly back at his brother, but with a playful look of his eyes at Sophie. She smiled at him as she picked up his mug and stood up to go into the kitchen. "You're going to have to find something useful to do with all that energy," she said over her shoulder as she walked towards the glass doors. "I've got an idea or two," Billy replied back, making Sophie smile again. "There's tissue in the bathroom, Bill," Josh joked and laughed loudly. Billy laughed back as he replied, "I don't need tissue, not when a good woman will do much better." He spoke to Josh, but Sophie knew that Billy's words were meant for her. Obviously, Josh didn't, as he laughed louder. "Too right, but you'll have to find yourself one first," Josh said, as he took another swig of wine. "I'm sure I can find one who's willing," Billy replied, but once again Josh didn't catch on to the obvious indication to Sophie. Sophie just smiled over her shoulder at Billy. "I guess that all depends on how good you are to her." "I guess she'll have to find that out." "But I know that she'd find it good fun," Billy said to her with a little laugh. Sophie smiled once more over her shoulder before walking through into the kitchen, leaving the sound of the 2 guys talking about women behind her. With her heart racing, she walked over to the kettle and turned it on and began spooning in the 4 spoons of coffee into Billy's mug. While Sophie was placing the spoons of coffee into the mug, she was happily thinking that she hadn't flirted like this in a long time. She thought that staying faithful didn't mean she couldn't have fun. Because this certainly was fun, and she could give Josh a very enjoyable night too, so everyone was a winner really. Suddenly, Sophie felt something. "Oh, Soph, she heard a male voice whisper into her ear, confirming her thoughts that this was Billy and not Josh. "We shouldn't be doing this," she said. "I know," Billy replied. Closer and closer their lips got, the electricity surging through them both. She desperately needed, and she needed it right now. Closer and closer. And then alarm bells rang in Sophie's mind. "No," she said quickly, "we shouldn't be doing this." Then she turned around, with Billy moving a few inches back to give her room. Looking up at Billy's handsome face. Sophie was still completely, she desperately tried to tell herself inside that she didn't want to do this. "Billy, we can't do this," she said, as she looked up at him. "Why not?" he said, smiling, as he once again moved closer to her. "Because I'm your brother's fiancé," she said. If only he would kiss her now, and we've only just got engaged today. She lifted her left hand up between them to show him the diamond engagement ring on her third finger. She continued to try and tell herself inside that she would remain completely faithful, that she really didn't want to do this. But as she looked at the ring on her finger, Sophie only found the situation even more of a turn on. While her fiancé was. Where was Josh? The thought instantly brought panic into her, and momentarily removed all thoughts of lust from her mind. "Where's Josh?" Sophie asked nervously. "Is he still?" "It's okay," Billy said. "He went upstairs to the toilet before I came in." "He could be back down by now," Sophie continued, still panicking inside. If Josh had seen. "He said he wouldn't be long, and that maybe I should keep you company for a bit, so you don't get bored." "So, don't worry, he didn't see anything," Billy said. Sophie felt the panic disappear from her and relief set in, and then with the panic gone, she began to become very aware of Billy, "We shouldn't be doing this," she said quietly. "I know. But we both want to," he replied. "But Josh could be down any minute," she said. Once again her mind was trying to convince her that she wanted to stay faithful. "He told me to keep you company, he'd be happy," Billy replied. "What, if he caught you?" she whispered. She was about to ask him how he knew him when the kettle clicked, showing it had boiled. "Kettle's boiled," Sophie said, as she smiled up at Billy before turning around. "Coffee's ready," she said, as she finished stirring the dark liquid in the mug. "Thanks," Billy said, as he reached gently around her body to pick up the mug. "You're going to have to be careful, Bull, or I'm going to have to teach you a lesson if you keep doing things like that to me," Sophie said with a playful smile. "I look forward to it, Soph," he said with a confident smile, and then turned around to walk off into the lounge. Sophie watched as her fiancé's brother walked into the lounge, no doubt to talk to Josh like he hadn't been feeling his fiancée up in the kitchen moments before. She was now engaged to Josh, but her mind and her body only thought about his brother, and what was going to happen next. Josh sipped himself up and walked to the sink to wash his hands and splash some cold water over his face. The wine had given him a warm glow inside, not drunk, tipsy, and warm was how he felt inside. Smiling at himself, he walked out of the bathroom and headed for the stairs. As Josh casually walked down the stairs, he didn't even conceive of the idea that Billy and Sophie were flirting heavily in the kitchen at that moment. Walking into the lounge, Josh saw Billy coming through from the kitchen with the mug in his hands. "Feeling better?" his younger brother asked, as he blew on the coffee and made his way to the leather seat he had been sitting on all night. "Much," Josh replied with a smile. "Got your coffee then?" "Yeah," Billy replied, and then smiled as he sat down. "Sophie's good company." "Yeah, she is," he said, and smiled towards the kitchen thinking of his sweet fiancée. "And, I've got to say," Billy continued, as he took a sip of his coffee, "she makes the best cup of coffee. I've never seen anyone make it like she does." Josh smiled proudly. He knew that Sophie was amazing, and that made him even more proud. He was going to marry this girl, this amazing girl who so many guys wanted. She was all his now. Just then, the object of Josh's every happy thought walked through from the kitchen with another open bottle of wine. He wanted her too, but he wanted to talk to Billy first. It had been ages, and the waiting would make Sophie hornier. He smiled back at her as she sat down, smiling lovingly at him, before beginning to talk and start a conversation off. He was so happy that his brother and fiancé were getting on so well. If only he actually knew how well they had become acquainted so far, and how much both of them wanted to know each other better, even if Sophie was trying to convince herself otherwise. The conversation picked up where it had left off, and soon all three of them were laughing and joking again, Josh and Billy talking about old times, and Sophie joining in to add tales about Josh, and listen to other funny stories from both of the brothers. The wine also continued to flow between Josh and Sophie, though neither one was anywhere above being slightly tipsy, and the coffee continued to flow for Billy. Sophie said she's feeling a little tired. Bill, what a lightweight, huh? Josh jested at his fiancée. As Billy sat back down in the leather chair, the buzz of the coffee still flowing through him. He just smiled back at his brother in amusement as he watched Sophie take a final sip from her wineglass before gently placing it on the coffee table. I didn't say I was tired, babe, I said I wanted to go to bed, she said with a slight smile, and a look towards Billy. She really had that teasing look down perfectly. Every time she did it, she made Billy strain harder to be free. Yeah, you should go to bed then, Soph, and leave the guys with stamina here, Billy jested at the stunning blonde as he smiled. Josh just laughed lightly. Sophie just smiled playfully back at Billy, but the glow in her eyes couldn't have been mistaken as anything but a hello, I want to speak to you alone, look, and it was then that Billy finally clicked on to the meaning Sophie had put into what she was saying. Actually, bro, I'm a bit tired as well, I might go and crash for the night. You know, big day ahead, Billy said again quickly, earning him a satisfied smile from his brother's fiancée. Josh just laughed before he spoke, topping his glass up again. Well, I guess you're still no match for me, Billy. He jested, so much for the bull, babe. I don't know, babe, we'll just have to see, Sophie replied. Well, off to bed with you both then, Josh said, I'll be up in a minute, babe, I want to finish this bottle first, then I might take a bath or something. No rush, babe, I'll be there when you get there, she said with a loving smile, before turning to smile playfully at Billy. He couldn't believe that this girl, who could look so lovingly at his brother, could flirt so heavily with him. I'll show you where your room is if you want, Billy, Sophie said, not really asking at all. Billy tried as hard as he could not to leap up immediately. Instead, trying to keep his cool, he rose normally. Sure, he began, his heart racing. He knew Sophie wouldn't want to sleep with him, but he had to find a way, it was now or never.